The doctor, when he arrived some 20 minutes later, confirmed what was already evident to anyone possessed of basic observational skills. Howard Blackwell had been dead for approximately 2 hours, which placed the time of death somewhere between 1 and 1:30 in the afternoon, precisely when the garden party was in full swing and the attention of every guest was directed toward the lawn, the roses, and the elaborate social performance that such gatherings demanded. Inspector Graves, a man of perhaps 50, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with human failings, arrived within the hour, having been summoned from the market town of Ashford some 8 miles distant. He was a competent officer, Miss Marple reflected, watching him move through the house with methodical efficiency, but competence and imagination were not always companions, and Inspector Graves, while thorough, seemed to lack the latter quality in generous measure. He examined the body with appropriate professionalism, noting the position of the letter opener, the lack of defensive wounds, the absence of any obvious signs of struggle. The morning room, he observed, showed no evidence of disturbance beyond the obvious fact of the murder itself. The desk was orderly, the papers upon it arranged with the precision one would expect from a solicitor of Blackwell's meticulous nature. There was no indication that violence had preceded the fatal wound, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no scattered correspondence suggesting a desperate struggle. This fact alone should have suggested to any investigator worth his salt that the murderer was someone whom Howard Blackwell had known and trusted, someone who had approached him from behind with sufficient proximity to deliver the blow without resistance or alarm. Inspector Graves, however, seemed less interested in such nuances than in establishing a timeline of the afternoon's events and taking statements from those who had been present. Lady Ashworth, dignified despite the shock of having her social triumph interrupted by murder, explained that she had known Blackwell for 30 years and had invited him to the party some 2 weeks prior, wishing to discuss certain matters concerning her will. She had not, she emphasized, expected him to be murdered in her morning room. Eleanor Hartley, her composure gradually returning though her hands continued to tremble, explained that she had gone upstairs at 3 o'clock to retrieve a shawl she had left in her bedroom, had walked past the morning room, and had seen the body through the partially open door. She had screamed because, as she rather reasonably pointed out, one encountered murdered solicitors so very rarely in one's life that the experience could not fail to be shocking. Edward Ashworth stated that he had been on the lawn throughout the afternoon in the company of his wife and Colonel Harrington, discussing the prospects of the local cricket team. His wife Patricia confirmed this account with a smile that seemed somewhat forced, and Colonel Harrington, with characteristic bluffness, assured the inspector that he could vouch for Edward's presence, though he had little patience for cricket discussions and had primarily been observing the roses. Miss Marple, when questioned, provided a simple and entirely accurate account of her afternoon. She had sat beneath the oak tree, she explained, observing the party's progress. She had seen nothing unusual, heard nothing suspicious, and had been as startled as everyone else by Eleanor Hartley's scream. This last statement was technically accurate, though Miss Marple's startlement had manifested itself in a manner quite different. From that of most other guests, a slight elevation of her eyebrows and a small intake of breath rather than the dramatic expressions of shock that had characterized the responses of younger, more theatrically inclined villagers. What she did not mention to Inspector Graves, though the observation had registered in her mind with crystalline clarity, was that Victoria Hartley, when she had come inside with the others, had not seemed particularly surprised by the discovery of Howard Blackwell's body. Surprise, Miss Marple knew from a lifetime of observation, was extremely difficult to counterfeit convincingly. One might control one's facial expression to some degree, might school one's voice to convey concern or shock, but the eyes were considerably more difficult to manage. Victoria's eyes had held no shock whatsoever. They had held, instead, a quality that Miss Marple could only describe as resignation, as though she had been expecting something dreadful to occur, and had merely been waiting for it to materialize. By the evening, word of the murder had spread through Little Ashworth with the efficiency of wildfire traveling through dry brush, and the village had settled into that peculiar state of excitement and anxiety that murder always produced. The garden party guests had been dismissed to their homes with requests that they remain available for further questioning. The local police constable had been posted at Apricot Hall to prevent the disturbance of evidence, though by this point the morning room had been thoroughly trampled by Inspector Graves's personnel, and whatever subtle traces might have remained had likely been obliterated. Miss Marple returned to her cottage just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, her mind working through the afternoon's events with the methodical precision that had characterized her thinking for more than a year. She had known Howard Blackwell only slightly, as one knew most solicitors, as a necessary evil, competent in his particulars, but of no great interest otherwise. Yet she had known enough about him to understand that he was not a man who accumulated enemies through malice or cruelty. He was, rather, the sort of man who accumulated them through simple disregard, through the inadvertent revelation of secrets that others preferred to remain hidden, through the cold professionalism that treated human vulnerability as merely another item to be filed and catalogued. And here, Miss Marple reflected, as she settled into her favorite armchair with her knitting, was where the matter became genuinely interesting. The following morning, the village of Little Ashworth awoke to news that seemed to transform the murder from an abstract tragedy into something far more immediate and troubling. The newspapers, having descended upon the quiet village with the voraciousness of carrion birds, had already begun their speculations, and the London papers had picked up the story with considerably more enthusiasm than the local constabulary seemed to appreciate. Solicitor murdered in Manor House read one headline, while another, in a publication of more sensational bent, proclaimed Death Among the Roses, Mystery at Apricot Hall. Miss Marple, reading these accounts over her morning tea, noted with some amusement that the newspapers seemed to know considerably less about the actual circumstances of the crime than did the villagers themselves, a situation that would likely change within the next few days as reporters tracked down increasingly dubious sources willing to provide increasingly fanciful interpretations of events. What interested her far more than the newspapers was the behavior of the village's inhabitants in the aftermath of the murder. By mid-morning, she had received separate visitors to her cottage, each ostensibly bringing flowers or inquiring after her health following the shock of the previous day, but each primarily interested in sharing gossip and gathering more of the same. Mrs. Pemberton, the cook from Apricot Hall, arrived first, ostensibly delivering a basket of fresh eggs but actually eager to share details about the morning room that she had overheard discussed by Inspector Graves and his sergeant. According to Mrs. Pemberton, the letter opener that had served as the murder weapon had been handled so carelessly by the various police officers that one could hardly imagine any useful fingerprints remaining upon it. More interestingly, Mrs. Pemberton revealed that Lady Ashworth had been observed speaking at length with Howard Blackwell in the library on the previous evening, and their conversation had apparently been conducted in tones that suggested disagreement if not outright hostility. I heard her say quite distinctly, Mrs. Pemberton reported with evident satisfaction, that she would not tolerate such behavior, and he replied that she had no choice in the matter. Miss Marple, who had learned decades ago that the interpretation of overheard fragments of conversation was a highly uncertain enterprise, asked gently whether Mrs. Pemberton might have misunderstood the context of such a discussion. Could it not have concerned some matter of estate management, some disagreement about the disposition of property or the management of funds? Mrs. Pemberton conceded that such might be possible, though her tone suggested that she found such a prosaic explanation considerably less satisfying than the alternative of assuming serious conflict between Lady Ashworth and her solicitor. The second visitor was the Reverend Ashworth's wife, Margaret, a woman of perhaps 60 whose primary occupation seemed to consist of knowing Eve. Ryone's business with remarkable precision. She arrived with the stated purpose of inviting Miss Marple to a small prayer circle that the church ladies were organizing in light of the tragedy, but her actual purpose appeared to involve the revelation that Victoria Hartley had been seen speaking with Howard Blackwell in the village some 3 weeks prior, and their conversation had been of such an animated nature that witnesses had wondered whether they were engaged in passionate disagreement or passionate reconciliation. Margaret, who possessed the particular talent of making innocent statements sound profoundly incriminating, noted that Victoria had always been such a peculiar person, choosing to live so quietly, spending so much time alone with her music, never quite fitting into the normal rhythms of village life. "One cannot help but wonder," Margaret observed with the kind of false delicacy that masked genuine malice, "what secrets such a person might be harboring. Young women who withdraw from society so completely often have reasons for doing so, do they not?" Miss Marple, who had known any number of people who preferred solitude to society and had found them, on balance, considerably more honest than those who thrived on social performance, made a non-committal response. The third visitor was Colonel Harrington himself, who appeared in Miss Marple's garden just after noon, ostensibly to inquire whether his wife's mother, an elderly woman residing in the neighboring village, might have sent regards through Miss Marple, whom she occasionally encountered at church gatherings. This transparent fabrication disposed of, the Colonel settled himself into Miss Marple's wicker chair and revealed his actual purpose, to share his conviction that Edward Ashworth had likely been present in the morning room at some point during the afternoon, though he could not precisely account for Edward's movements during a particular 20-minute interval when the Colonel himself had stepped away to speak with a gardener about the care of roses. "Young Edward has always been rather difficult to pin down," the Colonel observed thoughtfully, "and his finances have been in rather poor condition for some years now. It is not unreasonable to suppose that a solicitor such as Blackwell might have discovered matters in his affairs that were best kept confidential." By early afternoon, when Miss Marple sat down to her luncheon, she found herself in possession of a remarkable collection of speculation, insinuation, and half-remembered conversations that the village had generated in the wake of the murder. Each of these pieces of information, individually, might mean very little. Collectively, they painted a picture of a community in which multiple individuals possessed reasons to wish Howard Blackwell removed from their lives. Lady Ashworth had apparently disagreed with him about matters sufficiently important to provoke raised voices. Victoria Hartley had spoken with him in a manner suggesting either significant conflict or significant history. Edward Ashworth's finances were troubled, and a solicitor's discretion might have represented a burden to him. Eleanor Hartley, while she had discovered the body, had apparently not expressed particular grief at Blackwell's death, merely shock at the manner of its discovery. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, none of this necessarily indicated culpability. The human heart was a complex mechanism, and the reasons people did things were rarely as simple as the surface facts suggested. Inspector Graves, who had spent the better part of 2 days pursuing the various threads of gossip that the village had so generously provided, found himself increasingly frustrated by the abundance of suspects and the paucity of concrete evidence. Hence, by Wednesday morning, he had settled upon what seemed to him the most logical line of inquiry: Edward Ashworth's financial difficulties. A preliminary examination of Edward's affairs, conducted through discreet inquiries to several banking contacts in London, had revealed that the young man was indeed in considerable financial distress. His inheritance from his father had been largely depleted, his business ventures had proven unsuccessful, and his wife Patricia's considerable personal fortune, though not insignificant, had been placed in trust by her family in such a manner that Edward could access only the income it generated, not the principal itself. Howard Blackwell, as the family's solicitor, would certainly have been aware of these circumstances, and it was conceivable, Inspector Graves reasoned, that Blackwell had threatened to inform Lady Ashworth of the precarious state of Edward's affairs unless Edward paid him a substantial sum. Such blackmail, if it had occurred, would certainly provide a motive for murder. Accordingly, Inspector Graves requested that Edward Ashworth present himself for questioning at the police station in Ashford on Wednesday afternoon, a request delivered with enough official formality that it could hardly be ignored. Miss Marple, having observed Edward's departure from the village in a somewhat agitated state that morning, decided that the moment had arrived for her to take a rather more active role in her inquiries than she had thus far permitted herself. She dressed with her customary care, arranged her hair, and made her way to Apricot Hall, where she requested an audience with Lady Ashworth on the pretense of inquiring whether she might assist with any charitable functions that the shock of the murder might have temporarily displaced from consideration. Lady Ashworth, a woman of her own generation who valued Miss Marple's company considerably more than she valued that of most people, received her warmly in the morning room itself, a choice that seemed to Miss Marple to suggest either remarkable courage or remarkable detachment. They sat in the very room where Howard Blackwell's body had been discovered, and while the floor had been thoroughly cleaned and the furniture rearranged, there remained an indefinable quality of unease, as though the room itself retained some memory of violence. "You must forgive the choice of venue," Lady Ashworth said, settling herself into a chair with the deliberate control of someone managing both age and grief. "I find that I am determined not to be driven from my own home by the mere fact of murder. It would give the crime far too much power over my daily life, and I will not permit that." Miss Marple, who admired this sentiment immensely, nodded with genuine approval. "A sensible approach," she observed, "though I confess that I have always found it remarkable how quickly even the most shocking events cease to disturb us once we have determined that they shall not do so. The human mind possesses a quite extraordinary capacity for adaptation." They spoke for some time about charitable matters of no great consequence, but as their conversation progressed, Miss Marple gradually directed the discussion toward the evening before the murder, when, according to Mrs. Pemberton's account, Lady Ashworth and Howard Blackwell had engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Lady Ashworth, when this matter was raised with appropriate delicacy, seemed not at all discomfited by the inquiry. "Mr. Blackwell and I did indeed have a disagreement," she confirmed calmly. "I had discovered that certain funds from my estate had been invested in ventures of which I had not been informed, and I was quite naturally displeased. However, the matter was one of business, not of personal animosity. I was angry, certainly, but one does not murder one's solicitor because one is angry about one's investments. If one did, I suspect solicitors would be among the most frequently murdered professionals in the country." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile at this observation. "And yet," she ventured carefully, "Mr. Blackwell must have had some response to your displeasure. Did he offer an explanation for these investments?" Lady Ashworth's expression tightened slightly. "He did, and it was not a satisfactory one. He claimed that he had acted in my best interests, that the investments were sound, and that I should trust his judgment in such matters. I informed him that I had not retained him to act according to his judgment, but rather to act according to my instructions, which is an entirely different matter." This exchange, Miss Marple reflected, revealed something of considerable importance. Howard Blackwell had apparently been engaging in activities on behalf of his clients that extended beyond the strictly authorized. Whether this represented simple overreach or something more sinister remained to be determined, but it certainly suggested that Blackwell possessed secrets about his client's affairs, secrets that might conceivably have motivated someone to silence him. Miss Marple then inquired, with the apparent casualness of idle conversation, whether Victoria Hartley had ever sought counsel from Blackwell regarding any legal matters. Lady Ashworth's response was immediate and emphatic. "Victoria," she said, her tone suggesting surprise at the question, "I cannot imagine what legal matters a woman of her circumstances would require a solicitor to address. She has no property, no income beyond what she earns from her music lessons, no family estate to manage. Though now that I think of it, there was some matter years ago, before she returned to the village, something that required legal attention in London. I do not know the precise details, but I gathered it was settled satisfactorily. This fragment of information, Miss Marple knew, required considerably more investigation. The fact that Victoria Hartley possessed a legal history, however minor, suggested dimensions to her past that might be considerably more complex than her quiet life in Little Ashworth would indicate. By the time Miss Marple took her leave of Apricot Hall and made her way back toward the village proper, the afternoon was advancing toward evening, and Inspector Graves, having completed his questioning of Edward Ashworth, was beginning to form conclusions about the case that would soon lead him toward an arrest. That arrest, Miss Marple reflected with some certainty, would be entirely wrong. Edward Ashworth was arrested on Thursday morning, taken into custody on suspicion of murder following what Inspector Graves described in his official report as a confession of dubious validity obtained through rigorous questioning. The actual facts of the matter were somewhat more complicated than such a description suggested. Edward had admitted, under the weight of Inspector Graves's persistent questioning, that he had indeed been desperate for money, that he had approached Howard Blackwell with the intention of requesting a loan, and that Blackwell had refused him with what Edward described as callous disregard for his circumstances. Edward had further admitted that he had harbored, for a brief period, murderous thoughts toward the solicitor, an admission that seemed to satisfy Inspector Graves's conviction that he had located his culprit. However, Edward had vehemently denied actually carrying out the murder, and when pressed for specifics regarding his whereabouts during the crucial 20-minute window when the murder had likely occurred, he handled a legal matter for Victoria Hartley approximately 7 years prior, and that this matter had concerned the settlement of a contested will. The details were, of course, confidential, but the junior clerk had inadvertently revealed that the matter had involved a substantial sum of money and had been concluded following what appeared to be a negotiated settlement rather than through any formal legal proceeding. Furthermore, and this detail seemed to the clerk to be of minor importance, but struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant, the settlement had been paid by Howard Blackwell himself, not by any other party. This single fact transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely. Why would a solicitor pay a settlement on behalf of his client unless there existed some compelling reason for him to do so? Why would such a transaction be conducted through a negotiated settlement rather than through normal legal channels? And most critically, what connection might this long-ago legal matter bear upon the present murder? Miss Marple decided that the moment had arrived for her to speak directly with Victoria Hartley, a conversation that she conducted on Thursday afternoon in the music room at Apricot Hall, where Victoria was engaged in her regular teaching duties. She arrived under the pretense of wishing to inquire whether Victoria might recommend a particularly gifted student for the village's Christmas musical recital, but once they were alone, with the afternoon light falling through the tall windows and the faint echo of piano practice emanating from a neighboring room, Miss Marple abandoned such pretenses. "I have been thinking," she said to Victoria, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, "about the strange ways in which the past influences the present, how events that occurred years ago, events that we believe resolved and settled, often continue to exert their influence upon our lives in ways we do not anticipate." Victoria, who had been arranging sheet music on the piano bench, stilled her movements. When she turned to face Miss Marple, there was something in her expression that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation. "You are quite perceptive, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Most people prefer not to think about how the past shapes us. They prefer to believe that we have control over our present circumstances, that we are not enslaved by events beyond our control. And yet," Miss Marple observed gently, "we are often profoundly shaped by such events, regardless of whether we acknowledge this fact, particularly when those events involve secrets, or when they involve people who possess knowledge that we would prefer to remain hidden." Victoria turned away, moving toward the window with the deliberate slowness of someone gathering her thoughts with great care. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Blackwell did me a grave disservice many years ago," she said, "a disservice that he compounded by his actions subsequently. I will not elaborate on the nature of this disservice, as it concerns matters that are not mine alone to reveal. However, I will say that his death does not grieve me, and I will further say that I do not believe Edward Ashworth is responsible for his murder." This last statement hung in the air between them with the weight of profound knowledge. Miss Marple set down her knitting carefully and regarded Victoria with an expression of gentle but absolute interest. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested softly, "you might explain precisely who is responsible." Victoria Hartley did not answer Miss Marple's question directly. Instead, she moved to the piano bench and sat down heavily, her shoulders curving inward as though the weight of years had suddenly become too much to bear. For a long moment, there was silence broken only by the distant sound of piano scales being practiced in another room and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall outside. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice carried the quality of someone unburdening themselves of a secret they had carried far too long. 7 years ago, she began, I was engaged to be married to a man named James Hartwell. He was the son of a wealthy family in Kent, well-educated, seemingly kind, and I believed myself to be genuinely in love with him. We were to be married in the spring. She paused, her fingers pressing against the piano keys without striking them, producing no sound. 3 months before our wedding, James died unexpectedly. The official report stated that it was an accident, a fall from his horse while riding in inclement weather. However, I came to discover that the matter was considerably more complicated than the official account suggested. James had been engaged in certain business dealings that were not entirely legitimate, and there were people who had reason to wish him dead. Furthermore, I learned that his family had been provided with substantial incentive to accept the official story regarding his death, rather than to pursue a more thorough investigation. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting needles continuing their rhythmic motion with an automaticity that suggested they required no conscious thought from her. She waited patiently for Victoria to continue, understanding that such revelations proceeded at their own pace and that interruption would only impede the flow of confession. At the time of James's death, Victoria continued, I inherited a considerable sum from his estate. James had made a will leaving the majority of his possessions to his family, but he had also made provision for me, P.E. Raps out of guilt regarding certain matters that he had kept hidden from me, or perhaps simply out of genuine affection. The amount was substantial enough to provide me with independence, and I chose to return to Little Ashworth rather than to remain in Kent, where I would have been reminded constantly of my loss. She turned to face Miss Marple once more, her dark eyes carrying an expression of mingled pain and resignation. What I did not know at the time was that this inheritance had been facilitated by Howard Blackwell. James's family had employed Blackwell to handle certain legal matters connected to the estate, and Blackwell had apparently taken it upon himself to ensure that the inheritance was processed in such a manner as to be easily concealed. He had, in effect, laundered money on behalf of James's family, allowing me to receive funds that should not have been mine according to the strict terms of the will, or at least not without considerable scrutiny from tax authorities and family members who might have contested the arrangement. Victoria's voice grew harder as she revealed this final detail. When I returned to Little Ashworth, Blackwell appeared several times, making it clear that he expected some form of compensation for his discretion and his services. He suggested that I was morally obligated to him, that without his assistance I would never have received the inheritance at all. He implied that should I fail to accommodate his requests, he might feel compelled to reveal the true nature of the inheritance arrangement to various authorities who would certainly wish to know about it. In effect, he was blackmailing me, Miss Marple. For years, I have been making payments to that man, payments that represented my capitulation to his moral corruption. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the calm that had characterized her response to all of the D.I.'s disclosures. She set down her knitting and folded her hands carefully in her lap. And yet, she said thoughtfully, you did not murder him. Despite the provocation, this I believe to be true, and Inspector Graves's conviction regarding Edward Ashworth is, I suspect, equally mistaken, which suggests that there is another person in this drama who possessed both motive and opportunity that neither Edward nor you possessed. Victoria's expression suggested that she had anticipated this conclusion. There is, she confirmed quietly, though I did not understand the full extent of it until yesterday, after Mr. Blackwell's death was announced. It was Eleanor Hartley, Miss Marple, not Eleanor as the instrument of death, but Eleanor as the catalyst that set everything in motion. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, the only visible indication of the significance she attached to this revelation. Eleanor Hartley, she repeated thoughtfully. Eleanor, who discovered the body and raised the alarm. Eleanor, who ostensibly had no connection to Howard Blackwell beyond her position as companion to Lady Ashworth. Victoria nodded slowly. "Eleanor Hartley is my mother," she said, "though this has not been publicly acknowledged. When my father died many years ago, Eleanor was left with very little, and circumstances were such that she could not raise me herself. I was raised by distant relatives in London, and Eleanor took a position as a companion to various ladies of means. However, we maintained contact, and our relationship, while unconventional, has always been close. Eleanor has known for years about the blackmail, about Blackwell's predatory behavior toward me, and she has harbored considerable resentment regarding his actions." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely audible. "What I did not know until this morning was that Eleanor had recently discovered another of Blackwell's secrets, something that concerned Lady Ashworth directly, and that would have caused considerable scandal had it become public. Eleanor had apparently been present when certain documents were left unguarded in Lady Ashworth's study, and she had read enough to understand that Blackwell was engaged in activities far more sinister than mere blackmail. She had resolved to confront him, to demand that he cease his predatory practices entirely. When they spoke on the afternoon of the garden party, Eleanor informed me afterward that Blackwell had been unmoved by her threats, that he had laughed at her and had suggested that he would continue his behavior precisely as he saw fit, regardless of what Eleanor thought or what she might do. Miss Marple rose from her chair with a careful deliberation that age had made necessary, and moved toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to take on the golden quality of late day. She stood for a moment in silence, her gaze directed toward the gardens of Apricot Hall, where the roses continued their indifferent blooming, untroubled by human violence or moral complexity. When she turned back to Victoria, her expression carried the weight of decades of observation and understanding. "You must understand," Miss Marple said gently, "that what you are suggesting, what you are implying through your careful revelation of facts, constitutes an admission that would ordinarily compel me to inform the authorities immediately. And yet, I find myself in a curious position, for I have lived long enough to understand that justice and the law are not always perfectly aligned, and that sometimes the truth, when revealed at the wrong moment or in the wrong manner, can cause damage that far exceeds any benefit it might provide." She settled herself once more into a chair, positioning herself so that she could observe Victoria's face clearly. "However, before I make any decisions regarding my course of action, I require certain clarifications. You have told me that Eleanor discovered documents that revealed Blackwell's activities to be considerably more sinister than mere blackmail. What precisely did those documents reveal? And more importantly, what evidence exists that would connect Eleanor to the actual commission of the murder, beyond the testimony of circumstantial motive?" Victoria's composure, which had remained largely intact throughout her previous revelations, wavered slightly at this question. She stood abruptly and moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of various volumes without truly seeing them. "I do not know the precise contents of the documents Eleanor discovered," she admitted. She was reluctant to discuss them in detail, saying only that they concerned matters of financial impropriety on a scale that would ruin multiple prominent families if revealed. As for evidence connecting her to the murder itself, I possess none that I could offer to the authorities. Eleanor has maintained throughout that she did not kill Blackwell, that when she left him in the morning room he was alive, that she had merely been attempting to persuade him through reason and threat to cease his activities. Miss Marple's keen eyes fixed upon Victoria with an intensity that suggested she was observing far more than the visible facts of the young woman's appearance and demeanor. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you believe that she did commit the murder. This is not a suspicion born of evidence, but of something more subtle, is it not? Something connected to the nature of Eleanor's character, to what you know of her capacity for violence or her emotional state in the aftermath of confronting Blackwell." Victoria turned away from the bookshelf, her face revealing an internal struggle between loyalty to her mother and the recognition of truth. "Eleanor has always been a woman of considerable determination," she said finally. "She has endured circumstances that would have broken many others, and she has done so with a quiet strength that I have always admired. However, I have also seen her capacity for protective fury when those she loves are threatened. She had made repeated attempts to convince Blackwell to cease his blackmail of me, and he had consistently refused. When she discovered the additional information regarding his activities toward Lady Ashworth and others, something within her appeared to crystallize. She spoke with an intensity that I had never previously witnessed, a coldness that was profoundly unlike her normal demeanor. Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing this characterization with the precision of someone cataloging observations for later analysis. "I see," she said thoughtfully. "And you believe that this coldness, this intensity, represents a state of mind from which murder might flow. But I must ask you, Miss Hartley, why you are revealing this information to me, rather than attempting to protect your mother through silence. Surely you understand that in speaking to me, you are potentially setting in motion events that will lead to Eleanor's arrest and prosecution." Victoria's eyes filled with tears that she made no effort to conceal, a display of genuine emotion that contrasted sharply with her carefully controlled demeanor throughout most of their conversation. "I came to understand this morning," she said, her voice trembling, "that Edward Ashworth is innocent, that he is being persecuted for a crime he did not commit. I also came to understand that my continued silence regarding Eleanor would constitute a betrayal not merely of justice, but of Eleanor herself. If she did indeed commit this murder, then Eleanor must face the consequences of that action. To shield her through deception would be to diminish her, to suggest that she was not responsible for her own choices. And Eleanor is nothing if not a woman who has always accepted responsibility for her actions, however difficult the consequences." Miss Marple regarded Victoria with an expression that combined approval with profound sadness. "You are a courageous young woman," she said, "and you are correct in your assessment that Edward Ashworth is innocent. However, I must inform you that the matter is considerably more complex than either you or Eleanor may have realized. The person who murdered Howard Blackwell was not Eleanor Hartley, though Eleanor's confrontation with him may well have precipitated the events that led to his death. The true murderer is someone whose motive is more compelling than Eleanor's, someone whose connection to Blackwell runs deeper and carries greater consequences than you appear to understand." Victoria stared at Miss Marple in astonishment, her face registering the shock of having her carefully constructed understanding of events overturned entirely. "But how? Can that be possible?" she demanded. "Who else possessed both motive and the opportunity to commit such a crime?" Miss Marple rose once more from her chair, moving toward the door with the deliberate slowness that characterized her movements. "That," she said, "is a question that I believe we must address directly, and I believe that the answer may be found if we examine not the events of the past 2 days, but the events of many years ago. There is someone in this village, Miss Hartley, whose connection to Howard Blackwell predates even your own involvement with him, and whose reasons for wishing him dead are far more fundamental than anything we have thus far considered. I must now take my leave, but I suggest that you remain here and say nothing of our conversation to anyone, not even to Eleanor, until such time as the true circumstances of this murder become apparent to all." With that, Miss Marple departed the music room, her knitting needles tucked neatly under her arm, leaving Victoria standing alone among the silent piano and the fading afternoon light. Miss Marple made her way directly from Apricot Hall to the vicarage, a modest stone cottage situated adjacent to the small Norman church that had served the village of Little Ashworth for nearly 800 years. She arrived just as the Reverend Ashworth was preparing to take his evening walk, a daily habit he maintained with almost religious regularity, and she intercepted him in his study with a request that they speak privately regarding a matter of considerable delicacy. The Reverend, a man of perhaps 65 with the gentle demeanor of someone who had spent his life attempting to ameliorate human suffering through the application of Christian charity, invited Miss Marple to sit and offered her tea, which she declined with her customary politeness. "I have come," Miss Marple began without preamble, "to inquire about a matter that concerns your wife, Margaret, and I do so with full recognition that such an inquiry may seem impertinent. However, I believe that the matter is of sufficient importance that the potential offense to propriety must be overlooked in service of truth. The Reverend's expression shifted from gentle welcomingness to something more guarded, though his basic courtesy remained unchanged. "I am not certain that I understand your meaning, Miss Marple," he said carefully. "My wife is a woman of impeccable character and considerable dedication to the life of the parish. If you have concerns regarding her conduct, I must insist that you articulate them with precision rather than through implication." Miss Marple nodded, appreciating his defense of his wife, even as she recognized it as a defensive reaction to perceived criticism. "I do not concern myself with your wife's conduct in general," she clarified. "Rather, I am interested in a specific matter regarding her family history. I believe that Margaret may have connections to Howard Blackwell that extend considerably further back than either she or you may have acknowledged, and I believe that this connection may be relevant to understanding the circumstances of his death." The Reverend's face underwent a subtle transformation, a series of small shifts in expression that suggested the activation of memories he had apparently preferred to leave undisturbed. He rose from behind his desk and moved toward the window, where the evening light was casting long shadows across the garden. "That is a matter," he said slowly, "of which I was not previously aware that anyone in the village possessed knowledge. It is not a subject that Margaret and I have discussed in many years, and it is certainly not a matter that has any bearing upon current events." Miss Marple waited in patient silence, understanding that the Reverend would provide further information when he had adequately composed himself to do so. Indeed, after a moment of reflection, he turned back toward her and continued his explanation. "When Margaret was a young woman," he said, "before she became my wife, she was engaged to be married to a man named Thomas Blackwell, Howard Blackwell's younger brother. Thomas was a promising man in many respects, though he possessed certain weaknesses of character that would eventually prove catastrophic. He and Margaret were genuinely fond of one another, and the engagement was viewed with favor by both families." The Reverend returned to his desk and seated himself once more, his movements suggesting the weight of carrying old sorrows. However, Thomas died under circumstances that were never entirely clarified. He apparently took his own life, though the family was reluctant to acknowledge this publicly, as suicide carried profound social stigma, particularly in that era. Howard Blackwell, who had inherited a substantial sum from his parents and had begun his career as a solicitor, chose to manage the matter in such a way as to suggest that Thomas's death was accidental rather than intentional. He did this partially, I believe, out of concern for his family's reputation, but also partially, I suspect, out of a desire to ensure that Margaret would inherit nothing from the family estate that might have reverted to them had Thomas's death been classified as suicide. The implications of this revelation hung in the air between them with palpable weight. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she brought to all significant disclosures, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quality of profound understanding. "And did Margaret accept this version of events?" she asked gently. "Did she believe Ward Blackwell's characterization of her fiancé's death as accidental?" The Reverend's hesitation before responding suggested that this was precisely the question that had occupied his thoughts for decades, the question that had perhaps never been fully resolved between him and his wife. "I do not believe," he said finally, "that Margaret accepted any version of events entirely. I believe that she has always suspected the true circumstances, and I believe that Howard Blackwell's manipulation of the facts, while ostensibly performed in the interest of protecting the family, has always troubled her conscience. However, we have never discussed the matter in explicit terms. Some things, Miss Marple, are understood in marriage without requiring direct articulation." Miss Marple rose from her chair with a slow deliberation that characterized all her movements, signaling that her inquiry was concluded. "I am grateful for your candor," she said to the Reverend, "and I am grateful particularly for your willingness to acknowledge matters that must be profoundly painful. However, I must inform you that there are additional considerations regarding Howard Blackwell's conduct that extend beyond the matter of his brother's death. I believe that Margaret should be made aware of these considerations, and I believe that the present crisis regarding Edward Ashworth's arrest may well provide the catalyst for such awareness." She moved toward the door, pausing before departing to add one final observation. Blackwell was a man who accumulated secrets, she said thoughtfully. He collected them as others might collect art or antiquities, and he hoarded them not out of any desire to protect those to whom the secrets belonged, but rather out of a desire to maintain power over them. In doing so, he created a web of dependency and resentment that eventually became so complex that violence appeared to be the only means of escape from it. This is a pattern, Reverend, that I have observed many times throughout my life. The human capacity for harm increases exponentially when we believe we hold power over others through their secrets. By the time Miss Marple had made her way back to her cottage as darkness fell over the village, she had visited 3 additional homes and conducted 3 additional conversations of considerable delicacy and revelation. She had learned that the Reverend's wife, Margaret, had indeed harbored deep resentment toward Howard Blackwell for nearly 50 years, though this resentment had been expressed through quiet disapproval rather than active hostility. She had learned further that Colonel Harrington possessed his own secrets regarding Blackwell, secrets connected to financial improprieties that had occurred decades earlier. And most crucially, she had learned that there existed one person in the village whose connection to Blackwell was so recent and so profoundly damaging that murder appeared almost inevitable as a response to it. By Friday morning, the village of Little Ashworth had settled into a state of uneasy acceptance regarding Edward Ashworth's arrest, though a small contingent of residents harbored persistent doubts about his guilt. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had compiled what he believed to be a sufficient case for prosecution, and he was preparing the necessary documentation for the Crown Prosecutor's office when Miss Marple requested an audience with him at the police station in Ashford. The inspector, who had developed a cautious respect for Miss Marple during the course of their previous interactions, received her in his office with a combination of courtesy and wariness that suggested he anticipated she might present information that would complicate his investigation rather than facilitate its resolution. Miss Marple settled herself into the chair across from his desk with her customary composure and began her presentation without preamble or unnecessary elaboration. "I have come to inform you," she said, "that Edward Ashworth is innocent of the murder of Howard Blackwell, and that your investigation, while thorough in certain respects, has proceeded upon fundamentally flawed assumptions regarding both motive and opportunity. I am further prepared to identify the actual perpetrator of this crime, though I must warn you that the circumstances are considerably more complex and considerably more tragic than your current understanding suggests." Inspector Graves's expression registered the particular frustration of someone whose carefully constructed theory was about to be dismantled, but he maintained sufficient professional composure to listen to what Miss Marple had to say. "I am listening, madam," he replied, gesturing for her to continue. Miss Marple outlined with meticulous precision the information she had gathered regarding Victoria Hartley's inheritance, Eleanor Hartley's relationship to Howard Blackwell through his blackmail scheme, the Reverend Ashworth's wife's connection to Blackwell through his brother Thomas's death, and Colonel Harrington's financial dealings with the solicitor decades earlier. She explained how Blackwell had operated as a man who collected and weaponized secrets, how he had built a network of influence through the strategic revelation and concealment of information, and how his predatory behavior had extended across decades and affected multiple individuals and families within the village and beyond. However, Miss Marple continued, while all of these individuals possessed motives for wishing Blackwell dead, none of them possessed the specific combination of motive, opportunity, and capability that would have led to his murder on the afternoon of Lady Ashworth's garden party. The person who committed this crime is someone whose connection to Blackwell is far more recent and far more devastating than any of these long-standing grievances. She paused, allowing the inspector a moment to absorb this assertion before continuing. "I believe that the perpetrator is Patricia Ashworth, the wife of the man you have arrested for her crime." Inspector Graves's eyebrows rose sharply, registering genuine surprise at this revelation. Edward Ashworth's wife. But the woman has an alibi. She was speaking with the Reverend Ashworth's wife throughout the afternoon, and her movements have been accounted for. Miss Marple shook her head gently but firmly. Her movements during most of the afternoon have been accounted for, she corrected. However, there was a period of approximately 12 minutes when she stepped away from the group, ostensibly to retrieve a handkerchief from inside the house. During this time, she had the opportunity to make her way to the morning room, where Howard Blackwell was working on Lady Ashworth's legal documents. This I know because I observed her departing the group at precisely 2:53 in the afternoon, and she did not return until 3:05. The murder itself occurred at approximately 3 o'clock, placing her absence squarely within the temporal window of the crime. The inspector leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting that, while he was hearing Miss Marple's assertions, he was not yet fully persuaded of their validity. That is circumstantial timing at best, Miss Marple. What possible motive could Mrs. Patricia Ashworth have possessed for murdering a solicitor she scarcely knew? Miss Marple's response came swiftly and with absolute certainty. She possessed a motive far more compelling than her husband's financial distress, a motive born from desperation and betrayal. I discovered, through careful inquiry, that Patricia Ashworth was once engaged to a young man named James Hartwell, a man from Kent whose death 7 years ago was officially attributed to a riding accident, but who was, in fact, murdered by persons unknown. Howard Blackwell handled the legal arrangements following James's death, and through his activities in that regard, he became aware of a fact that Patricia had apparently kept hidden from her husband Edward, that she had inherited a considerable sum from James Hartwell's estate, a sum that she had been concealing through a complex arrangement of shell accounts and false financial records. Miss Marple paused to allow the inspector to absorb this revelation before continuing. What Patricia did not know was that Howard Blackwell had recently decided to dissolve his blackmail schemes, to retire from his practice and move away from Little Ashworth. However, before departing, he intended to extract one final payment from Patricia Ashworth, a sum of money that would have constituted a substantial portion of the inheritance she had been concealing. He informed her of his intentions on the afternoon of the garden party, and he indicated that should she refuse to comply, he would inform her husband of the inheritance and its concealment. For Patricia, who has built her marriage upon a foundation of financial secrecy and whose personal security depends entirely upon maintaining Edward's trust, this threat appeared to constitute an existential danger to her entire life. In her desperation, she retrieved the letter opener from Lady Ashworth's morning room desk, an action requiring no planning, merely opportunistic recognition, and she used it to eliminate the threat that Blackwell represented. It was not premeditated murder, Inspector, but rather a crime of desperate impulse, born from panic and the human instinct for self-praise. Ovation when one believes one's entire world is collapsing. Inspector Graves sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full implications of Miss Marple's revelations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone of reluctant conviction. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then we must immediately release Edward Ashworth and apprehend his wife. I confess that I am not entirely satisfied that your reasoning constitutes proof that would satisfy a court of law, but it certainly provides sufficient grounds for reopening the investigation with this new focus." Miss Marple inclined her head in acknowledgement. "You will find," she said, "that if you examine Patricia Ashworth's recent financial transactions, you will discover evidence of payments to Howard Blackwell extending back several years. You will also find, if you examine the letter opener itself with greater care than was initially applied, that there are traces of evidence that may connect it definitively to Mrs. Ashworth rather than to her husband. But more importantly, if you speak to her directly, with knowledge of the inheritance and with understanding of her desperation, I suspect she will confess. The human conscience, Inspector, often finds concealment more burdensome than confession, particularly when the burden of concealment has become unbearable. Patricia Ashworth was arrested on Friday afternoon, taken into custody at her home in the presence of her husband, who initially refused to believe the charges against her until Inspector Graves produced evidence of the concealed inheritance and the regular payments to Howard Blackwell that had been extracted over several years. Edward Ashworth's expression during this revelation, underwent a transformation so profound that observers present at the scene later reported, feeling a sense of profound discomfort at witnessing a man's entire understanding of high marriage collapse in the space of mere minutes. Patricia, when questioned by Inspector Graves in the presence of a solicitor hastily summoned from Ashford, initially maintained her innocence with a composure that suggested either genuine belief in her ability to escape accountability or a state of psychological dissociation from the reality of her circumstances. However, when Inspector Graves revealed that Miss Marple had identified her, and when he detailed the evidence of her financial concealment and her absence from the garden party during the precise window when the murder had occurred, something within her capitulated. She requested that the solicitor leave the room, and she then proceeded to provide a detailed confession that accorded almost precisely with Miss Marple's reconstruction of events. She explained that she had inherited the money from James Hartwell in the aftermath of a romantic relationship that had occurred before she met Edward, a relationship that she had never disclosed because she had believed it irrelevant to her subsequent marriage. However, Howard Blackwell had discovered evidence of this inheritance during his handling of legal matters for James's family, and he had recognized the opportunity for profitable blackmail. For 7 years, Patricia had made regular payments to Blackwell, always fearful that he would reveal the truth to Edward, always terrified that her marriage would dissolve if Edward discovered both the inheritance and the years of concealment that had preceded it. The final confrontation had occurred on the afternoon of the garden party, when Blackwell had informed her that he intended to extract one final substantial payment before retiring from his practice. When Patricia had refused, he had indicated his intention to inform Edward immediately, threatening to destroy the marriage that Patricia had built with such careful deception. In her panic, Patricia explained, she had followed Blackwell inside the house, had found him alone in the morning room, and had retrieved the letter opener from the desk without conscious thought of what she intended to do with it. The actual moment of the stabbing had seemed to occur almost outside her conscious awareness, as though her body had acted according to impulses that her mind had not explicitly authorized. "I did not plan to kill him," she stated repeatedly during her confession, her voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment, as though the reality of what she had done had not yet fully penetrated her consciousness. "I only meant to make him understand that I would not permit him to destroy my life. I only meant to stop him from speaking." By Saturday morning, news of Patricia Ashworth's arrest and confession had spread through Little Ashworth with the rapidity of wildfire, and the village had settled into a state of stunned introspection regarding the implications of the revelations. Edward Ashworth had withdrawn entirely from public view, his shame at his wife's deception compounded by his humiliation at having been arrested for a crime he had not committed. Eleanor Hartley, learning that her confrontation with Blackwell had not directly led to his death, experienced a complex mixture of relief and lingering guilt regarding the years she had harbored murderous thoughts toward the man. Victoria Hartley, freed from the burden of suspecting her mother of murder, began the process of rebuilding her life with the knowledge that the secrets binding her to Blackwell's predatory behavior had been exposed and rendered ineffectual through his death. Miss Marple, having accomplished the resolution of the murder, returned to her cottage and resumed her customary life with a demeanor that suggested that she had merely interrupted her knitting for a brie. While conducting a minor errand. On Saturday evening, the Reverend Ashworth appeared at her door with the express purpose of expressing gratitude for her role in uncovering the truth regarding his wife's long-standing connection to Blackwell, and, more importantly, for her intervention in preventing his wife from harboring resentment that might have festered into something far more destructive than it had already become. He explained that Margaret had experienced a profound sense of relief at learning that Blackwell's manipulations of her fiancé's death had finally been exposed to scrutiny, that speaking openly with her husband about matters they had avoided discussing for nearly 50 years had created a new intimacy in their marriage. "You have freed my wife from a burden she has carried for decades," the Reverend stated, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "And you have freed her from the burden of unspoken resentment toward me for not fully acknowledging or addressing the trauma that Blackwell's actions inflicted upon her." Miss Marple received this gratitude with her customary grace, and deflected the Reverend's appreciation with gentle insistence that she had merely observed patterns in human behavior that others had overlooked. However, when he departed, she permitted herself a moment of reflection regarding the true cost of Blackwell's predatory behavior, a cost that extended far beyond his death, and affected not merely those he had directly victimized, but also the entire social fabric of the village. On Sunday morning, the church was filled to capacity for services, a phenomenon that typically occurred only at Easter and Christmas. The Reverend Ashworth delivered a sermon on the nature of forgiveness and the Christian imperative to understand that all human beings were capable of moral failure when subjected to sufficient pressure and desperatio. His words seemed directed not merely toward Patricia Ashworth, whose arrest had transformed her from respected village matron to pariah in the space of a single afternoon, but toward the assembled congregation regarding their own capacity for judgment and condemnation. After the service, Miss Marple stood in the churchyard observing the various clusters of villagers engaged in conversation, noting how information regarding Patricia Ashworth continued to circulate and evolve, how the original facts of the case were already being supplemented by speculation and embellishment that bore increasingly limited resemblance to actual events. She recognized this process with the weariness of someone who had observed it countless times throughout her life, understanding that the truth, however carefully established, was always subordinate to the narratives that communities constructed regarding crime and culpability. Lady Ashworth approached her as she stood observing this social theatre, and together they walked through the churchyard in companionable silence until they had reached a position sufficiently distant from the other mourners to permit private conversation. "I have been reflecting," Lady Ashworth said, "upon the manner in which secrets permeate our lives, and upon the extent to which we are all imprisoned by information that others possess regarding us. Howard Blackwell operated as a kind of jailer, did he not? Holding the keys to cages that we had constructed for ourselves through our own choices and concealments." Miss Marple nodded slowly, considering this characterization with the careful attention she brought to all observations regarding human nature. "He did indeed," she agreed. "And yet it seems to me that we construct such cages willingly, and we surrender the keys to others through choices that we make in moments when we believe that concealment is préfet." Rabel to truth. Blackwell merely recognized the opportunity that such self-imposed imprisonment created, and he exploited it with the efficiency of a man who understood that human vulnerability is the most profitable commodity in existence. The trial of Patricia Ashworth took place in the autumn, nearly 6 months after the murder of Howard Blackwell, and it proceeded with the inexorable logic of English justice, moving from preliminary hearings through to final verdict with the grinding certainty of a machine designed to process human transgression into legal judgment. Miss Marple attended none of the proceedings, having provided her testimony to the Crown Prosecutor's Office in written form and having declined all requests from newspapers and interested parties to discuss her role in identifying the murderer. She remained in Little Ashworth, pursuing her customary activities with a steadfastness that suggested the murder and its aftermath had constituted merely a minor interruption in the orderly progression of her life. Yet those who knew her well, and this included Lady Ashworth, understood that the case had affected her profoundly, though she expressed this effect through subtle changes in her demeanor rather than through any explicit acknowledgement. She knitted with somewhat greater intensity than was her custom, and her gaze often seemed to drift toward distant horizons as though she were contemplating matters that extended beyond the immediate present. The verdict, when it was rendered, came back as guilty on a charge of manslaughter rather than murder, the court finding that while Patricia Ashworth had indeed caused Blackwell's death, the circumstances did not constitute premeditated murder, but rather a crime of passion committed under extreme duress and psychological pressure. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence that seemed to many in Teach village to represent a kind of mercy, an acknowledgement that her crime, while inexcusable, arose from circumstances of such particular vulnerability that strict legal retribution would constitute a kind of injustice in itself. Edward Ashworth, humiliated by his wife's betrayal and traumatized by his own arrest for a crime he had not committed, sold his family's estate to a London businessman and relocated to the continent, where he attempted to reconstruct his life away from the village that had witnessed his public degradation. His departure left a void in the social structure of Little Ashworth, a void that was never entirely filled by any subsequent arrival or event. Eleanor Hartley continued in her position as companion to Lady Ashworth, though the relationship between them had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of Eleanor's connection to Victoria and by the disclosure of the years of blackmail that Eleanor had endured. Yet this altered relationship seemed to deepen rather than diminish their affection for one another, as though the exposure of hidden truths had created a more authentic foundation for human connection than propriety and careful concealment could ever establish. Victoria Hartley continued her quiet life as a music instructor, though she gradually expanded her practice and eventually moved into Ashford, where she established a small music academy that became known for its excellence and its commitment to identifying and nurturing genuine musical talent among students of limited financial means. By winter of that year, Little Ashworth had returned to its customary rhythms, the scandal having faded into the background of village life as new concerns and new dramas emerged to occupy the collective attention of its inhabitants. Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage on a particularly cold December afternoon, received an unexpected visitor in Teach, form of Inspector Graves, who had made the journey from Ashford specifically to speak with her regarding matters that he found himself unable to articulate through official channels. He settled himself in her sitting room, accepted a cup of tea with genuine gratitude, and proceeded to explain that he had been reflecting deeply upon the manner in which he had initially constructed his investigation regarding Blackwell's murder. "I had become," he admitted with a candor that seemed to cost him considerable effort, so committed to the narrative that Edward Ashworth's financial difficulties had constructed that I was unable to perceive the actual truth of the situation. I had allowed my expectation to shape my observation rather than permitting my observation to inform my expectation. It was a failure of investigative rigor, and it was a failure that very nearly resulted in the conviction of an innocent man. Miss Marple listened to this confession with the patient attentiveness that had characterized her response to all of the confessions and revelations that had emerged in the aftermath of Blackwell's murder. "You were not uniquely culpable in this regard," she said gently. "The human mind constructs narratives to explain phenomena, and once a narrative has been established, it becomes remarkably resistant to revision in the face of contradictory evidence. I have observed this tendency countless times throughout my life, and I have learned to regard it not as a personal failing but as a fundamental characteristic of how human consciousness operates. Your error was not exceptional, Inspector. It was merely typical." Inspector Graves seemed only partially comforted by this assessment. "Yet you did not make such an error," he observed. "You perceived the truth with a clarity that I, with all my training and experience, could not achieve. I have been attempting to understand how this was possible." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care and regarded the inspector with an expression that combined fondness with a kind of melancholy understanding. "You attribute to me a clarity that I do not believe I possessed," she said thoughtfully. "What I possessed, rather, was a particular kind of ignorance that proved advantageous in this situation. I had no investment in the official narratives of crime and punishment. I had no institutional pressure to arrive at a resolution quickly and efficiently. I had only time and observation, and the particular luxury of being able to follow threads of inquiry wherever they led without concern for whether such inquiry would be regarded as appropriate or productive by my professional colleagues. It is a luxury that you, as a professional investigator, do not possess, and it is a luxury that has become increasingly rare in our modern world, where efficiency and productivity are valued above contemplation and observation." After Inspector Graves had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage as darkness fell outside her windows, and she reflected upon the events of the preceding months with the comprehensive understanding that only time and distance can provide. She thought of Howard Blackwell, a man who had accumulated such power through the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability that his death had been almost inevitable once multiple victims had finally perceived the destruction that his predatory behavior was inflicting upon their lives. She thought of Patricia Ashworth, a woman whose single moment of desperation had transformed her from respected matron to convicted criminal, and whose punishment would now extend across decades of imprisonment. She thought of Eleanor Hartley, who had harbored murderous rage for years only to discover that violence, while tempting, ultimately, resented a violation of the principles by which she had chosen to live her life. And she thought of Victoria Hartley, who had emerged from this darkness with a quiet dignity and a determination to construct a life of genuine meaning and purpose. The human capacity for both moral failure and moral redemption, Miss Marple reflected, was truly remarkable. And the detective's role, she understood, was not merely to identify culpability, but to comprehend the extraordinary complexity of human motivation and circumstance that gave rise to crime in the first place. With these reflections occupying her mind, she returned to her knitting, the needles moving with the rhythm and precision that had characterized her actions for so many decades, and she settled into the quiet companionship of solitude that had become the primary comfort of her advancing years.